Module 3, Scale Apps in Azure App Service. In this module, we will learn about the scenarios for which auto-scaling is the best option. How do you configure the auto-scaling rules for a web app and the effects of auto-scaling? Now, what is auto-scaling? As I told earlier, when there is a demand, automatically more number of servers getting added. And after the demand is gone, automatically the additionally added servers getting removed is called auto-scaling. So the demand could be like the CPU consumption, number of requests per second, or it could be the total bandwidth per second, or any such factors you can consider. So this way, you no need to keep more number of servers active all the time. At the same time, you no need to face downtime just because you had less number of servers used for your architecture. And that's how this works. Now, the auto-scaling factors are going to be like, this auto-scale is available based on the things which I told you, like the request per second, CPU consumption, memory consumption, or it could be even the data traffic. So this auto-scaling can do scale out and scale in, and the difference between a scale out and scale in is like scale out is more number of servers get added based on the demand, and scale in is additional servers get removed based out of the demand. Similarly, there is a concept called scale up and scale down. What is that? Scale up is if there is a server with 2 CPU cores and 4 GB RAM, you change it from 2 CPU cores to 8 CPU cores, or let's say 2 CPU cores to 4 CPU cores and RAM of 16 GB. That is, you're changing one server to higher configuration. That is scale up. And in a scale down scenario, a server that had 8 CPU cores and 16 GB RAM, you change it into 4 CPU cores and 8 GB RAM, and that's your scale down. So if you understand the fact, in the scenario of scale up and scale down, you're changing the current server configuration, which will cause a reboot. So slight downtime could be expected for your application. But in a scenario of scale out and scale in, everything works as you expect because it's additional servers getting added and load balanced. So you can ensure that you do not face downtime. So considerations for auto scaling could be, if you want to save money, and you should give an elasticity where your servers can meet the demand flexibly. You want to provide a fault tolerance architecture that is available all the time for the customer. And you want to ensure that your services are sustainable and ensuring to grow your relationship with the customers in long term by scaling the demand. There it is good to use this facilitation. Now, some identifying auto scaling factors could be these. The auto scaling conditions. That's the metrics you have to focus on. Like, I understand that CPU consumption could be key factor for my application. Then I could say average CPU consumption or maximum CPU consumption goes more than 90. Then add more servers. I can choose conditions like that. You can also go for things like the maximum length of a disk queue, which is going to be any data being read from there. Or you can set schedules like Saturdays and Sundays or festival days. You can specifically pick certain days and you can choose a time slot where auto scaling can happen. You can create multiple conditions to handle this. So multiple conditions combined together, you can do complex auto scaling scenarios. The metrics for auto scaling, there are so many. A few of them includes CPU percentage, memory consumption, disk queue length for any input and output requests that you have, HTTP request for number of client calls you get, number of data in, that is the megabytes of data you receive, or data out, amount of data that goes out of the server can also be certain criteria. So based on all these and many more such signals, you can do your scaling. When you want to enable auto scaling in app service, how does that work? Auto scaling is not supported in all the pricing tiers. For example, I go for a basic pricing tier. I go for a shared or a free pricing tier. You may not get auto scaling. You may get manual scaling in one of these pricing tiers. So that's one of the pointer to be noted. You should be in a production pricing tier for auto scaling. And again, when you talk about scaling, it cannot be done in a go. You have to choose a proper scaling condition. So a proper auto scalable rule has to be chosen and selected by you. Followed by that, you can create scaling rules, and those rules play a very important role. That means if you want to do scaling on a demand basis, you can choose the respective metric, which could be a date or a time, or it could be a signal, and do the scale. And to monitor the scaling behavior, you can see the run history chart that shows you the complete history about number of times and days the scaling happened. You will even have the logs for tracking the transactional information. Now, best practices for auto scale is that you should set a minimum and maximum instances that you want to scale in between. What is that? So maximum is like, say you set an auto scaling rule to add a VM when average CPU consumption is more than 90% for 5 minutes. It's happening on and on. There is no point in adding 30 instances because it may cause you to exceed your budget. Similarly, when the demand is less, say CPU consumption is less than 30%, remove a VM you say, and it removes all the VM on and on until there is only one VM. That could also be an issue. So setting minimum and maximum limits to ensure that you don't go more than maximum number of VMs and you don't come less than minimum number of VMs is a best practice. Next thing could be selection of the right metrics. You should choose the right metrical value that defines how the scaling happens, which is a best practice. Next is your threshold. So you should choose the threshold of metrics, which means you should choose when the maximum or when the minimum CPU consumption or memory or whichever I told you, the threshold like maximum of 90%, 70% or maximum number of requests per second like 1000 requests per second, that numbers, the maximum threshold, you should choose properly. You should also make sure when you're adding multiple rules for a scaling, there is a scenario where one rule might do a kind of complexity where it could do a conflict with another rule. So those condition analysis should be done properly by you. And always choose something called default instance count. What is that? Sometimes your rules are fluctuating, your performance is fluctuating, where autoscale cannot take a decision to either go with minimum or maximum VMs, which is scale out or scale in. So those cases, there is an option called default instance count. If I say default instance count 3, then regardless whatever the min or maximum or scaling rules that are happening at that moment, it will keep those number of default instances to ensure that there is no downtime. And also as a best practice, you can configure a notification. So configuring an auto scale notification could ensure that you will have a very good information about what's happening around and you can try to make things go better on a daily basis. As a summary of this learning path, in this module, you learned about the scenarios for auto scaling. How do you do auto scaling rules for web application and monitoring your auto scale? And don't forget to give a shot for the knowledge check questions on the right side.